Great, let's make a start. We're in Proverbs 5 this afternoon. And as we start this passage in Proverbs 5, I think just a few comments perhaps might be helpful to put it into some kind of context for you. Firstly, it's worth saying it is a bit of a jump from where we've been. We've been in Proverbs 2. That's partly because we've got a baptism next week, and we often jiggle with the order a little bit to make things easier and more appropriate for lots of visitors at baptisms. So we will be jumping back, if you like, to Proverbs 3 next week. And for all sorts of reasons, this passage in Proverbs, and this isn't the easiest week. For some of us here, and for some of you, things in it will cut close to the bone. Either perhaps because of your own marriage or a marriage close to you. Maybe because of singleness and your struggle with that. But what is here in Proverbs is for us as a church. And what is here has to at some point be said, and we, wherever we are, do need to hear it. For others here, the language in places in this Proverbs and the sexuality, if you like, of it will feel slightly awkward. But it is in the Bible. It is God's word to us, and it is at points how he speaks to us. So there is a sense in which we have to embrace it. So that said, as we kind of approach this chapter of Proverbs 5, I've got kind of three things I want us just to have hovering, if you like, in the background as we work through it. And the first thing is this. These are the proverbs and the sayings, largely of King Solomon. We saw that right back at the beginning of Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1. And so they are generally written to instruct his son or his sons who would one day potentially take the throne as the king of God's people. You see that actually at the beginning of our passage in verse 1. My son, be attentive to my wisdom. That means as we go through it, the language in it is gendered. It is through most of Proverbs, actually. It's written to a son. That means at points there are things which are particularly relevant to sons and men. However, that said, lots of Proverbs is equally relevant whether you are a son or a daughter. And it doesn't take much work to translate it. So as we read, you'll just sometimes have to do a little bit of that work and a little bit of that translation. But it shouldn't be a surprise that we see so much aimed at sons, because its direct focus is to a royal son to help him grow in wisdom. That's the first thing. The second thing, just have hovering in the back of your minds as we approach this, is the idea of sex and marriage. They're common themes actually through Proverbs, but they do have wide implications. They come up time and time again in the Bible, but especially in Proverbs. And what we don't want to lose as we read these instructions is that in some way they're all intended to be pictures and lived displays, as you like, as what Richard was saying earlier, of the way Jesus and his bride, the church, relate. And at this point, that's perhaps especially true because it's true of Israel's kings, and the family line we're reading about was the family line Jesus was to be born from. Solomon had a particularly complicated and a messy family tree when it came to these things. I've realized I put this slide in. Oh no, I did put it in the right place. There we go. Solomon had a particularly complicated and messy family tree when it came to these things. I mean, you've got David just above. He's in blue up there. I mean, he had the incident with Bathsheba where he got this spectacularly wrong with terrible consequences. Solomon himself managed to have 700 wives at least. So perhaps he learnt a thing or two over the years. But it would be as you follow this line down and end up somewhere down near me, where you get to his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson Jesus, who would one day sit on his throne and live out this wisdom that we read in some ways to the fullest. He was the one who would lay down his life for his bride, the church. And in that, all of us, wherever we are, can rejoice. That means there are things here that are helpful for all of us. For those who are married, for those who aren't married, for those who may one day be married. And we'll come back to some of those implications later as we get towards the end, but have it again hovering in the background. Thirdly, the little final last thing to have hovering that wider picture of God-fearing choice making of Proverbs is still in the background and still in play here. That's still the root behind this. How do you live a good life in God's sight, making good choices and wise choices? And this area of marriage and relationships is one of those areas where we really do need to make good choices and sometimes complicated choices and wise choices that will honor God. So what I want to do as we look at Proverbs 5 is break it into three parts, three acts, if you like, of Solomon's wisdom. First, hear the reality. Second, don't overestimate yourself. And thirdly, make your marriage a delight. Let's start with hear the reality. Look down at the first few verses of Proverbs 5. And the picture in the first three verses is this. It's a picture of someone who looks good, who sounds and seems good. Someone who we'd all perhaps naturally be drawn to, even if this imagery that Proverbs uses isn't the words we'd choose. Verse 3, the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. Dispel any pictures, if you like, of this kind of slightly crazed, seductive, adulterous woman. That's not what Proverbs is warning about. This is someone, it says, who doesn't necessarily even think that trying to draw someone to them, of starting an intimate relationship outside of marriage, that's what the idea of the forbidden woman is getting at. Someone who doesn't even think getting involved is even in itself problematic. There isn't a God-fearing attitude at play, if you like. Verse 6, she does not ponder the path of life. Her ways wander and she does not know it. It's not the imagery we would use, but you get the idea. The lips, they drip honey. There is a sweetness to the words that come out of the mouth. This is someone who says, you know what you want to hear. The things that sound good, the things that are appealing, the things that draw you back just for a little bit more. The speech too, it's smoother than oil. It's easy to listen to. The conversation flows well. There aren't any sharp barbs. There's just something pleasant about it. I think here Proverbs recognizes something that most of us probably know. That lots of inappropriate adulterous relationships, they don't begin where they end. They begin with words, with speech, with relationships forming. Perhaps they begin where the words of a spouse have stopped sounding sweet but have started sounding bitter. Where they're no longer smooth but they've become sharp with barbs and bite. Perhaps they begin where a simple distance and an absence has grown. And it's in those moments, isn't it, that the sweet, the smooth sounding words of another start to seem and feel appealing. Most people don't start married life, or even before they get married, looking for another and thinking they'll be seeking somebody outside of their marriage. If you think back to the video we had, no one was saying, how long do you think your marriage will last? Well, about 2 years, really, then I'll find someone else. It's not how it begins, but it's often how it ends up. Nowadays, I think this idea often gets termed an emotional affair or emotional infidelity. This is from an article in The Guardian last November. There's a story of a lady called Chloe. Chloe had encouraged her husband to accept the new job. I told him, life's too short to be unhappy. The effect on him was transformative, but not in the way she'd imagined. One minute he was the family guy, the next he was always working late and going in early. She found out why when she visited him one day at work. My heart dropped when I saw them talking to each other. They had this closeness, says Chloe, 49. I realized then that it was her that had come between us. He went to her with problems, shared secrets and aspirations, all those things we used to do together. The common conception is that an emotional affair is a precursor to a physical one. A little bit of chemistry or sexual tension is typical of emotional affairs. Solomon had seen this thousands of years earlier. But he also saw beneath the surface, and he saw the devastation that this caused. What starts as light relief, as sweet, as easy, as harmless, it never stays that way. But in the end, she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps follow the path to Sheol. That's the place of the dead. Sweet honey and smooth oil becomes in time bitterness and sharp. What promised a new life and a new kind of life becomes death. It's ultimately likely to lead you away if it persists from Jesus, although no one believes it will at first. Whilst it might not be a picture of someone who's intentionally out to kind of draw you and weave a web to draw you in, it is a picture of someone who, in a Christian way, isn't wanting you both to flourish, to grow, to live for Christ. In some ways, here we have a picture of two unwise people, not considering where they're doing is leading or heading. It's a picture of the choice of immediate pleasure and ease over long-term wisdom. And in the end, it becomes about finding sexual satisfaction outside the confines of marriage. Solomon sees the cost here in these words. That in the moment, or right at the beginning, it's hard to imagine could happen. And the cost is much bigger than you might ever think. Look through the passage from verse 5. Let me pull some things out. The cost, verse 5, death. In our terms, we might say it tends to lead us away from Christ and Jesus and the life he gives. It draws us away from his life-giving water. A loss of honor, verse 9. Who you are now in the sight of others. There is an impact on everything you've become, and it can be whisked away. Verse 10, a loss of strength, a loss of energy. You know, you work, you earn, you toil, and it ends up somewhere else. Even dealing with the situation you've created becomes utterly draining. And the resources, the things that should have gone to building your home, your family, supporting children, those around you, get swept away to others. Groaning. At the end of your life, it feels such a waste. Why? Why didn't I listen? It wasn't worth it. Down to verse 14. There's also a very public cost. I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation. What feels hidden and private eventually tends, one way or another, to come to the light and be known. And all those relationships across the church family are impacted. This isn't a private struggle, but it becomes a public one. Solomon wants us to ask the question right back at the beginning, is it worth it, really? Hear the reality of what is going on in those moments and don't be blinded by our own deceptions. So wisdom part 1, hear the reality. Solomon's wisdom part 2, though, don't overestimate yourself. Don't overestimate yourself. It says, keep your way far from her. Do not go near the door of her house. If you like, this is the minor response in the passage. But it's basically saying, don't overestimate yourself in the face of temptation. How often do you reckon the kind of thoughts going through our heads are, well, it'll be all right, we'll be all right. We won't let it go too far. This is nice, I enjoy this, and I know where the lines lie. Or I need a break from the chaos and the troubles at home. I need someone to talk to. And this is good, and perhaps it's good for our marriage too. How often do you think that warnings from other people and those around are rejected because they just don't understand? Or it's not what they think? Or we're just talking and I'll stop before we get too close or too involved? It's really hard to know how common affairs actually are, but it's at least around 20% of married people, 1 in 5 in the UK, at least. And a vast majority of those are with work colleagues or friends. And I'd speculate that very few of those happen in just a moment, just in one moment. Most of those people would have probably said, "Until death do us part," like in our video at some point. But how many of those started with people feeling that they had a handle on things, but were being drawn together with someone else over weeks and months, ignoring that pricking conscience, convincing themselves it was just friendly chat, just a little bit of that kind of tension? So many couples who find themselves trying to recover after an affair will be able to tell you how what started as problems in their own marriage were initially satisfied by somebody else. Someone to talk to, someone who understood, someone who was affirming, someone who lifted them up and they were drawn to, someone whose lips dripped, for want of a better way of putting it, with honey, and whose speech was smoother than oil. But there came a point somewhere down that line where they were becoming, as verse 20 puts it, intoxicated with a forbidden woman, intoxicated with someone who wasn't their spouse. But they still thought they could control it. They thought they could handle walking as close to the line as possible until they couldn't. If that's you in this room now, or it becomes you in the future as life rolls on, then hear Solomon's wisdom. Keep your way far from her. You need to step back, even if it's complicated work or friendship-wise. And it applies even if you're not married. In verse 3, it is a stranger or a forbidden woman. The simple point is it's somebody who's not your spouse. God created in his wisdom a context for a unity and exclusiveness and a persistence of relationship that would be a reflection of how Jesus and his church were to relate. And that reflection was going to be the commitment of marriage. It's quite possible to slide into a kind of pretend marriage that moves from close friendship to something more in a really unhelpful way. And that's where the wisdom of others around and an awareness of our own limitations is needed. So don't overestimate yourself. Don't overestimate yourself. Otherwise, more often than not, verses 12 and 13 lie somewhere in the future. How I hated discipline, and my heart despised reproof. I did not listen to the voice of my teachers or incline the ear to my instructors. So part 1, hear the reality of what's happening. Part 2, don't overestimate yourself. Part 3, make your marriage a delight. The relationship within a marriage can be better than you imagine. Looking down from verse 15. This whole section, this whole last bit, has intimate overtones running all the way through it. The idea of water, cisterns, wells, and fountains satisfying and bringing life and prosperity, they're all through Scripture. Here are a couple of things to notice. 1, it's your cistern, well, or fountain. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. There is a sense of belonging here, isn't there? Husbands and wives that belong to one another. The contrast running through this proverb and this section of Proverbs is don't satisfy your thirst for connection, for intimate relationship with those who are not yours, but satisfy those things with your own spouse. You belong to one another, and that kind of intimacy belongs with one another alone. There will always be other temptations that seem more appealing initially, that feel like they're going to be better than your spouse. that seem less complicated, more enjoyable, maybe especially as time goes on. The reference to the wife of youth in this passage suggests that this is talking about a period well past the well-known honeymoon phase of a marriage. But in short, Proverbs says it's not worth it. And turn back to your spouse and find satisfaction there. Which is the second thing to note. There are several things here that they're instructions. They're doing words, if you like. God-fearing, good choices. Drink water from your own cistern. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. And then there are other things that follow on. Let your fountain be blessed. Let her breasts fill you with delight. Be intoxicated, always in her love. This bit of Proverbs has a picture of marriage that is supposed to be a delight. And it's a call to strive for that. It knows something of the kind of irrational side, if you like, of this kind of love, which is like being a bit drunk, where you don't think clearly, where you act more on impulse, where you don't quite know when enough is enough, and it delights in it. And Solomon wants it for his son. But it also knows that that delight comes in part through the choices that are made. When you choose to go, where you choose to go to satisfy yourself, whether that's in the words you want to hear or the intimacy you crave, what you choose to rejoice in. And rejoicing in the wife of your youth is something to be done, not something that just happens. Your willingness to hear wise counsel and instruction is another thing to be done. These are the things the Proverbs say that generally lead to blessing, to delight, to satisfaction. For those who are married, this picture of what marriage can be might not be your experience at the moment. It may never have been your experience. It might seem distant and impossible. But Proverbs does give us a picture of marriage that can be better than we imagine is possible. But it doesn't suggest that it will just happen, or that it will in fact be easy. And you will have to choose at points whether you do what seems sweet and easy, or what might be much more difficult in the short term. You will need those around you who can speak into your marriage, who can warn you when it looks like you're drifting, and you will need a willingness to listen to them. Proverbs calls for a real change of heart that wants to delight and wants to be satisfied in your spouse, and is willing to choose to do that, and rejecting other places for intimacy. It doesn't call for half-hearted attempts that kind of leave other doors open or slightly ajar, or attempts that are unwilling to genuinely commit to finding delight and satisfaction in just that one person. If that is a really deep struggle for you at the moment, or if it seems impossible, then find those in the church family who might be able to help, who might be able to serve you as those who can teach you, who can correct, who can encourage, who can challenge, who can help you find ways of rejoicing in one another again, of finding that sense of satisfaction. There is often, and sometimes there is shame, and feels a sense of shame and fear in opening that box, in asking that question. But if you're not there, the trouble is already there. The challenge and difficulty is there, and there's no shame in recognizing it and seeking to do something wise and godly about it, rather than just quietly hoping it will go away. Similarly, if it's a deep struggle for you at the moment because you have no spouse, and perhaps you know the longings for someone who isn't your spouse, the draw and the temptation for something that goes beyond close friendship, then again find someone in the church family who can serve you in that way, who can walk with you, who can help you ponder the path of life, as it says, who can hear your struggle and help you navigate it wisely. If by God's grace you're not at that point in your marriage, in your walk with the Lord, then keep asking the question of one another. How can we rejoice in one another more? How can we increasingly be satisfied in one another? Who is it who knows us well enough to speak into our lives when they have concerns or when they think things might be heading the wrong way? Or have we isolated ourselves in some way from God's people? Who knows you well enough? Final thing to say. Why does all this matter so much? Why does Solomon give such airtime to this particular issue in Proverbs? Why does the Bible speak on the issue of marriage all the way through? I mean, these choices, they seem to be such a big deal in the Bible, but why? Well, this is where I want to finish, because it's not really just about us. It's not just about us. Every culture and every generation has its focus on what marriage is about. You know, sometimes it's about economic well-being. Sometimes it's about protection. Sometimes children and descendants, they are the primary focus. I think when we think about marriage, what do we think about naturally? When we think about relationships of that sort? Well, increasingly, I think we do think in terms of satisfaction, of enjoyment, of fulfillment, of expressing ourselves, of being loved. Even we also recognize there are other things going on. But the Bible, it has a broader picture than all of the above. It puts those kind of things, all of them actually, which can be good things, into a bigger context. And it gives us a purpose to why marriage. Because if we think about it, all of those things could exist without marriage. The unity, the faithfulness, the delight, and the love that should characterize marriage is, as to quote the Apostle Paul, it is a profound mystery. But I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Richard took us here helpfully earlier. Marriage matters so much because it points away from itself. And it's a God-created means of revealing something about the way Jesus loves the church and the church submits to Jesus. There are plenty of other ways God could have chosen to make humanity grow without needing marriage and without the kind of difference, unity, and faithfulness that it calls for. The rest of the animal kingdom manages quite well and quite happily. But marriage itself, it's deeply connected to how we image God as people. It's deeply connected to how we're rescued and how we're redeemed by God. And therefore, the wisdom which we all choose to live out our intimate relationships with others, it communicates something of who we think God is. It communicates something of what we think the church is and how Jesus relates to it. If you like, the relationship between Jesus and the church is the blueprint. It's the real deal. And in time, it's not yet, but in time, it will be perfect when the church eventually gets there. It's what marriage should image. It's what your marriage, if you're in one, should image. And so our marriages and the way we talk about it, the way we think about it, they communicate something to the world around and to one another about Jesus and his bride, the church. You see, it's not just what we say about marriage, and we can say a lot about marriage that matters, but it's also about how we live it out in our lives. And that's the case whether you're married or single, because the choices we make in this area and in these areas, they say something about how we see the relationship between Jesus and the church. We have, as 2 Corinthians said, and Emily read for us, been betrothed to one husband, presented as a pure virgin to Christ. And we should be living that out with a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. Our marriages matter because they reflect and they say something about Jesus and his church. So I'll finish with these 2 questions. When you look at your marriage, if you are married, when you look at your marriage, do you see in it a reflection of the love and devotion that should mark the church and Jesus? And if not, what are you going to change? What are you going to do? And secondly, when you look at your relationship with Jesus, when you look at the way our church relates to Jesus, does it reflect the kind of sincere and pure devotion that exemplifies the best marriages? If not, what's going to change? I'll leave those questions with you. And I didn't bring my notes up, so I've no idea what's happening next beat. We're going to sing as we reflect on those things. Let's stand together, and the children will come back in as we sing to our Lord.